Right, so the impassible God takes on a passible nature. So nonetheless, we must dismiss the reality that the New Testament, we must not dismiss, I should say, the reality that the New Testament emphasizes the suffering of the God-man in fulfillment of Isaiah's picture of the Messiah as the suffering servant. Thus, the impassible God takes on a passible nature. He always remains what he is, the eternal Son of God, and became what he was not, a human like you and me. And as God, he's able to take on that without changing himself. Jesus is subject to suffering in his human nature, and this serves two functions in the relation to the theodicy. First, it is necessary for the defeat of sin and evil. And second, it complements the sympathetic care that the impassible God extends to those who suffer. In this regard, the incarnation of the eternal Word as a passible, suffering human tells us that God knows our suffering, not just intellectually, but experientially.
Right. So now we're going to have to pursue this a little further, right?
Right.
And so he says the point here is clear. If God suffers for all eternity, then there's nothing uniquely redemptive about Christ's suffering on the cross.
Right.
So clearly Christ,
it keeps happening.
If God, so identified with our suffering and suffered with us and suffered throughout, all eternity because he knew, then there's nothing uniquely redemptive about Christ's suffering. Christ's suffering was unique. It was special. It happened once in time, place, and history, right? So the incarnation becomes, he says, if that's the case where God has suffered throughout all eternity, a pale copy of what God has been enduring all throughout eternity. And thus the true power of divine compassion, he says, is inextricably tied to the cross, where the suffering servant defeats the sources that first introduced suffering to the world.
Right. And again, this is why we have to talk about fully God and fully man. It's not a half and a half. It's not kind of a mixture. It's not one or the other. It has to be both these things.